Joining me back on the program today is Gad Saad, professor of marketing at Concordia University and author of The Consuming Instinct and the Evolutionary Bases of Consumption. You have this interesting article that you actually wrote a little while ago, but I think it's very relevant today, called On the Follies of the Politically Correct Language Police. So who are these police?
So they come in many different varieties. So, for example, in the context of where I live in Quebec, when we refer to the language police, we're talking about a branch of the Quebec government that goes around making sure that we don't violate French language laws. So, for example, there's a classic case that came up recently, which was facetiously referred to as Pasta Gate, because some restaurant on their menu had the word pasta, and pasta is not a French word. Pat is a French word, and so that caused a whole bunch of problems. But more generally, so moving beyond this Quebec context, the language police refers to a movement that is part and parcel of the politically correct ethos of the West, where people consistently find new ways to be offended, and hence we have to redefine how we label things lest somebody might be offended, and it becomes in this case a form of folly, hence the title of my article.
And you give a bunch of examples of this. And what's interesting is that when I look at the examples, they actually illustrate what is my kind of predominant view on this. And I'll give a few of the examples you give. For example, calling a secretary an administrative assistant is the correct term now. Calling a garbage collector a sanitation engineer is an example that you give. And I think those two examples, and many of the others, are a really good representation of what I think is going on. And I'll summarize my view, and of course, then we'll kind of talk about it.
Sure.
Here's the problem I have with political correctness as a concept. When political correctness leads to language that is increasingly disconnected from reality, I think that that's a bad thing. And that's, I think, where you're going with the language police. The problem is that political correctness is also used as a sort of ad hominem attack to attack just reasonable levels of sensitivity and empathy. So I guess first question is, can we agree, you and I, that changes to language that are deliberate are not by their inherent nature good or bad?
Agreed. Look, language is an organic entity. It evolves. And so there are terms that certainly would have had a pejorative historical context, in which case it makes perfect sense that language evolves to remove, for example, racist connotations associated with a particular label. So, yes, those forms of changes are perfectly fine. But as you said, the former examples is where we get into trouble, where we come up with ever more granular ways of dissecting what a label means, and it becomes silly because we can't keep up with the politically correct changes.
So let's see if we can narrow down and find where our respective lines are on this. And they may just be different for different people. Do you and I both agree? I mean, I certainly feel that deciding proactively we're not going to call Jewish people kikes or black people the N-word, that is drastically different than saying we should refer to fat or obese people as differently weighted. Do we agree that there's nothing in common with those two decisions?
Absolutely agree. No question.
Okay, so for you, what's the rubric or barometer that you apply to decide about about which category you put particular language decisions in?
I suppose if the existing descriptor is not one that historically had a pejorative connotation associated with it, then there is no reason to change it. So, for example, to say that somebody is obese, and I gave the example in the article where I joked, but I was being truthful, that my physician basically places me in the obese category based on some BMI standard, body mass index standard, right? Now, how silly would it be if I were to say to him, "How dare you say that I am obese? I'm simply differently weighted," right? So the term obese exactly describes somebody who is not at the correct weight. Now, if other people usurp that term so that it becomes something pejorative, that doesn't mean that we have to constantly shift the goalposts so that we come up with a way to describe people who are overweight without it ever having any negative connotation. So I guess that's where I would draw the line. If something is an accurate description of a phenomenon, then it need not be changed. Let me give you one other quick example. So for I come from the Middle East. We are Lebanese Jews. So many people refer to us as Oriental Jews, meaning that we come from the Orient. Now, many people no longer like that term because they're afraid that the word to say that somebody is Oriental is a bad term because they mix it up with being Asian, meaning from the Far East. But again, an Oriental Jew is a perfectly fine description of who I am. I am a Jewish person who comes from the Middle Orient. Nothing pejorative about that.
Are we kind of crossing into, when we talk about, your standard was if it's an accurate descriptor, we're crossing into something that to me seems like it could be dangerously subjective, because there are many terms that you and I would certainly consider to be offensive and terms that should be ruled out, which some would say, no, we should continue using that term because, based on my racist beliefs, for example, I believe it to be accurate. So is that not a little bit dangerous because it is very subjective?
I suppose you're right. I mean, I guess it all depends on the historical context, on on the shifting mores of a particular time period. So you're right. The standard that I tried to come up with as an answer to your question might not be a perfect one, but I certainly believe that we can both agree that if we're, for example, referring to older students, right, university students who come back to university later in life, describing them as older students is not a pejorative term, right? I mean, they are literally older students or
Sure.
mature students. Now people find those terms offensive under the rubric of ageism. Rather, we should refer to them as unconventional students, right? I can't remember the term yet, non-traditional students, right? So it's tough to know where to draw the line, but I think for most people we have an innate sense of what constitutes appropriate changes to a language and crazy political correctness.
What's the kind of intersection between this discussion and one more generally of framing in language? And the great George Lakoff has talked extensively about the successful use of language to frame issues in the United States by Republicans. For example, using the term tax relief, which directly implies that taxes are by definition a burden and that reducing taxes is a positive thing, right? Completely disconnected from the realities of why taxes are necessary. Or pro-life as another example of a framing that's been used in this way. Is there an intersection between these two conversations?
Absolutely, and actually, my most one of my more recent articles on Psychology Today, I referred exactly to what you just raised, the idea of taking a political ideology and usurping language in such a way that it advances your political ideology. So, for example, when we're talking about sexual assault, many ideologues now redefine the meaning of sexual assault to no longer mean a physical assault, but the male gaze becomes a form of assault. Catcalling a woman becomes a form of assault. By changing the definition of what constitutes sexual assault, then you can of course alter the statistics and alter possibly public policy. So you're absolutely right that there is an intersection between these two conversations.
Okay, and then I guess the last thing that I think is important is, and we'll use your example of catcalling and sexual assault. If someone comes to us and says, in all earnesty and honesty, when I was catcalled in this particular situation on the street in New York City, I truly felt physical danger, and I don't know that sexual assault is an incorrect term. Who are you or I to tell them that they are wrong in how they felt? And this is a separate conversation from that of policing language as a sort of form of policy. But don't we also need to be sensitive to that someone else's experience may be different than yours or mine?
Fair enough, but this is again where you enter a slippery slope. So, postmodernism and deconstructionism, in a sense, very much speaks to your last point because it says, everything is relative. The way that we each understand and deconstruct language is subjective. But of course, that itself becomes a form of folly because we can no longer agree on what is the meaning of the word sun, meaning the sun, the actual sun that gives me a sunburn. Some people like to call it sun, and as I famously recount in one of my personal stories, a postmodernist didn't like the fact that I used the term son. She calls it dancing hyena because she doesn't like to place labels on things. So I think there's a fine line between sensitive in the way that you're mentioning and then again sinking into the ludicrous.
And I think certainly that line is hard to draw exactly where it is for everybody. People should check out the article on the follies of the politically correct language police. We've been speaking with Professor of Marketing at Concordia University, Gad Saad. Thanks again for being on.
Thank you for having me. Cheers.